Imagine stepping into the cobblestone streets of a medieval city where the air itself seems to hum with intention. Every sound you hear, the distant toll of a bell, the murmur of a crowded market, the sudden quiet that falls as night descends, was not accidental. It was designed. In these ancient urban centers, sound and silence were not merely part of the atmosphere. They were carefully crafted tools of control, wielded by those in power to shape behavior, enforce order, and remind every citizen of their place in the social fabric. From the highest church tower to the quietest alleyway, the auditory landscape was a living, breathing extension of authority, and in this video, we're going to uncover exactly how that power was engineered, felt, and resisted. Think about the role sound plays in your own life today: the chime of a notification, the background music in a store, the sirens that signal urgency. Now amplify that significance 1,000-fold and place it in a world without digital media, without amplifiers, without any of the technologies we take for granted. In the Middle Ages, sound was one of the most immediate and visceral ways to communicate with the masses. Church bells didn't just mark the hour, they could quell a riot, announce a victory, or impose a curfew. Silence, too, was weaponized, enforced through laws and watchmen to prevent dissent and maintain a grip on the population after dark. This was a world where hearing was believing, and what you were allowed or not allowed to hear could define your freedom, your safety, and your very sense of reality. What's even more fascinating is how these historical strategies echo into our modern lives. The ways medieval rulers used sound to surveil, direct, and manipulate their citizens have striking parallels in today's society, from the use of auditory cues in retail and public spaces to the role of media and messaging in shaping opinion. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a lens through which we can better understand the present. Over the course of this video, we'll explore the architectural tricks that amplified authority, the psychological power of regulated noise and silence, and the subtle ways people found to resist and reclaim their sonic environment. You're about to embark on a journey that will change how you listen to the world both then and now. So lean in, and let's explore how the medieval world engineered sound and silence as tools of power. Now, let's consider the very stones beneath their feet. The materials chosen for medieval construction were not just about durability or aesthetics, they were selected for how they handled sound. Stone walls and cobblestone streets, for instance, are highly reflective surfaces. They bounce noise around, creating echoes that could carry a watchman's shout or the marching of guards far beyond its original source. This wasn't an accident, it was a feature. In contrast, the thatched roofs and timber frames of common houses absorbed sound, creating pockets of quiet that could be monitored for suspicious silence or hushed conversations. The city itself became a giant instrument, its materials tuned to the needs of those in charge, ensuring that the flow of information and the lack thereof always served authority. You could be standing in a narrow alley, and the way a whisper traveled or a footstep echoed was all part of a calculated design to make everyone feel both heard and overheard. This architectural manipulation meant that power wasn't just something you saw in a castle silhouette. It was something you felt in the very soundscape of your daily life, a constant, subtle reminder that the environment itself was engineered for control. Now picture the towering silhouette of a medieval church against the skyline. Its bell tower wasn't just an architectural feature, it was the city's central nervous system, and the bell was its commanding voice. This was no simple instrument. The casting of a large church bell was a major civic event, often funded by wealthy patrons or the ruling council. and its inscription might even include the names of local authorities, physically binding their power to the object itself. Once hung, the bell's voice carried for miles, a deep, resonant sound that could penetrate the thickest walls and reach every ear, from the noble in his manor to the poorest laborer in the field. This wasn't just about calling people to mass. The bell's tongue spoke a complex language of sequences and rhythms that everyone, regardless of their literacy or status, was taught to understand from childhood. A quick, frantic ringing of the alarm bell or tocsin would send a wave of adrenaline through the entire populace, signaling an immediate threat like a fire or an invading army. This sound triggered a pre-practiced response. Men would grab tools or weapons and assemble, while others would form bucket lines or secure the gates. Conversely, a slow, mournful tolling marked a death in the community, its solemn pace communicating respect and collective grief, but the bell's power extended far beyond emergencies and sorrow. The same sound that called the faithful to prayer also signaled the start and end of the workday for guildsmen, the opening of the market, and perhaps most importantly, the imposition of the curfew. The evening curfew bell was a sound of absolute authority. Its toll meant all fires were to be covered, all citizens were to return to their homes, and the streets were to be surrendered to the watchmen. To be caught outside after that bell was to be suspect, a violator of the peace, and subject to punishment. This auditory control created a powerful fusion of divine and earthly command. The sound came from the house of God, lending it a sacred, unquestionable authority. To disobey the bell was not just to break a civic law, it was to defy a rhythm ordained by heaven and enforced by the state. This rhythm structured every single day, creating a shared, regimented experience that constantly reinforced the existing social order. It reminded the merchant, the knight, and the serf that their lives were synchronized by a power greater than themselves. The bell ensured that time itself was not a personal possession but a communal resource, meticulously managed and distributed by those in charge. The church tower became the ultimate command center, not with soldiers but with sound, projecting an invisible net of control over the entire city that was felt as deeply as it was heard. But if the daytime belonged to the commanding sounds of authority, the night fell under the dominion of an even more potent force, silence. After the final curfew bell tolled, a profound and mandated hush descended upon the medieval city. This was not a peaceful quiet, but an engineered void, a weaponized absence of sound known as the curfew, which literally means cover fire. The law required all hearth fires to be banked or covered to prevent devastating blazes in tightly packed wooden cities, but this practical measure extended into a comprehensive demand for public silence. The streets were to be emptied, conversations were to be held behind closed doors, and any unnecessary noise became an act of defiance. This enforced quiet was patrolled by the watchmen, whose very presence was defined by the silence they were there to protect. Their footsteps on the cobblestones, the occasional low murmur to a fellow guard, or the sharp challenge to someone found outdoors, these were the only sounds permitted, and they served as a constant auditory reminder that the city was under surveillance. The penalties for breaking this nocturnal silence were severe and immediate. Being caught outdoors after curfew could result in hefty fines, a night in the stocks, or even imprisonment. The sound of a door creaking open late at night or a raised voice from a tavern was not just a nuisance, it was a direct challenge to civic order. This acoustic control served multiple strategic purposes for those in power. It drastically reduced opportunities for the crime that thrives under cover of darkness, from theft to vandalism. More importantly, it prevented the one thing authorities feared most: clandestine meetings. By eliminating the auditory cover of general nighttime activity, any gathering, any whispered conspiracy, any secret plot became dangerously exposed. The silent streets made every clandestine sound a potential betrayal, turning the community itself into an unwitting enforcer, as neighbors would be acutely aware of any unusual activity next door. This tool of power was not reserved solely for the night. During periods of intense political unrest or after the death of a prominent ruler, authorities could declare an official period of communal mourning that required public silence. The usual hustle and bustle of the marketplace would be stifled, public performances were banned, and even ordinary conversation in the squares was expected to be hushed. This imposed quiet was a powerful display of control, a way to suppress dissent by literally removing the people's ability to congregate and speak freely. It framed obedience as respect and compliance as collective grief, making resistance seem not only treasonous but also sacrilegious. The absence of sound became a palpable, heavy presence, teaching every citizen that their voice was a privilege granted by authority, not a right. In this carefully managed soundscape, silence was not empty. It was full of meaning and menace, a constant lesson that sometimes the most powerful command was simply to be quiet. Now let's step into the vibrant, chaotic heart of the medieval city, the marketplace. At first glance, it seems like a whirlwind of uncontrolled noise, vendors shouting, animals braying, the constant clatter of goods and coins. But to the trained ear, this was not chaos. It was a carefully composed symphony of commerce, and every note was regulated. The sounds of the market were as much a tool of economic control as any written law or tax ledger. Authorities understood that to control trade, they first had to control the sound of trade, so they created a system where even the simple act of shouting about the price of bread became a performative act of obedience to power. Consider the town crier, an official figure often dressed in the colors or insignia of the local lord or guild. His voice was not his own, it was an instrument of the state. At designated times, he would position himself in a central spot, perhaps on a raised platform or at the market cross, and deliver proclamations with a very specific, practiced cadence. He wasn't just sharing news, he was broadcasting economic decrees. He would announce the official prices set for grain after a harvest, the new taxes on imported wool, or the regulations governing the quality of bread. His cry carried the full weight of authority, and to ignore it was to risk severe penalty. This transformed the human voice into a living lawbook, making economic policy an auditory experience that no one in the marketplace could avoid. The regulation went even deeper with the guilds, the powerful associations that controlled every aspect of medieval craftsmanship and trade. A guild didn't just control who could make shoes, it controlled who could shout "shoes for sale." And exactly how they could shout it, guilds enforced strict acoustic territories. A butcher had a designated area and a specific cry, distinct from the fishmonger's call. This prevented undercutting and confusion, but it also rigidly enforced professional and social boundaries. An apprentice was forbidden from crying his master's wares in an unauthorized manner. The sound of your sales pitch was a direct reflection of your licensed status within the formal economy. This sonic branding meant that the very rhythm and tone of commerce reinforced the guild's monopoly on trade. For those outside this sanctioned system, the consequences were swift and harsh. Unauthorized vendors, known as regrators or forestallers, who tried to operate without guild membership or who shouted their prices in violation of the rules, faced immediate punishment. They could be fined, have their goods confiscated, or even be placed in the stocks for public humiliation. The goal was to make the informal economy acoustically impossible. If you couldn't cry your wares correctly, you couldn't sell them effectively. This turned the auditory landscape of the market into a means of economic enforcement, where the right to make noise was a privilege granted by power, not a natural right of commerce. This orchestration of sound served a dual purpose for those in charge. On the surface, it created order out of potential chaos, ensuring fair prices and standards for consumers. But on a deeper level, it constantly reminded every merchant and every customer that their economic lives were subject to surveillance and control. The hum of trade, the specific cries of vendors, the official proclamations, all of it was a performance under the watchful ear of authority. Every transaction, every shouted price, every coin exchanged happened within a sonic cage designed by the powerful. Commerce became a public ritual where the sounds of free enterprise were, in fact, a carefully composed melody of submission. And in this world without printing presses or digital networks, the most immediate and trusted medium was the human voice itself, raw and unfiltered, carrying the full weight of the law directly from the lips of authority to the ears of the populace. This was the domain of the town crier, a figure whose importance is hard to overstate. He was far more than a simple messenger. He was a living, breathing symbol of the state, a walking, talking bulletin board whose very appearance commanded attention. Dressed in a distinctive, often brightly colored uniform adorned with the official insignia of the city or the ruling lord, he was instantly recognizable. This uniform was not just for show, it was a wearable credential, a visual guarantee that the words about to be spoken were not rumor or gossip, but the official decree of those in power. His presence transformed any ordinary street corner into a temporary seat of government. The locations chosen for these proclamations were never accidental. They were strategic acoustic centers, selected for their ability to gather and hold a crowd. The town crier would position himself at a busy market cross, a central crossroads, or the steps of a prominent guild hall. These were places where people naturally congregated, ensuring his message would ripple out through the community with maximum efficiency. Before he even spoke a word, his arrival would create a stir. The sight of his official robe and the staff or bell he carried would cause a hush to fall over the crowd, a moment of anticipatory silence that itself reinforced the gravity of the occasion. This was a ritual, a performance of power where every element, from his costume to his podium, was designed to impress and intimidate. Then came the delivery. The crier's voice was his most vital tool, and it was trained for maximum impact. He didn't just read, he projected. He used a very specific, formal cadence, often beginning with a traditional call to attention like oyez. Oyez, oyez, a word derived from the French to hear, which immediately signaled the start of an official proceeding. His tone was carefully modulated depending on the message. An announcement of a public celebration or a royal birth might be delivered with booming pride and enthusiasm. In contrast, the reading of a new tax law or the declaration of a punishment would be stern, slow, and grave, leaving no room for misunderstanding the seriousness of the content. This control over tone allowed the authorities to manipulate public emotion directly, using a single human voice to inspire either collective joy or collective fear. But the process didn't end with one performance. Understanding that not everyone would be present for the first reading, the crier's work was one of relentless repetition. He would traverse the city, stopping at each designated proclamation point to deliver the exact same message with the exact same solemnity. This repetitive auditory reinforcement was a brilliant psychological tool. It embedded the law into the daily soundscape of the city, making it inescapable. You might hear the new edict about grain storage at the market in the morning, then catch fragments of it again from a distance in the afternoon, and finally hear it recited in full near your home in the evening. This constant repetition made the authority behind the words feel omnipresent and inevitable. There was no opting out. To live in the city was to hear and, by extension, to obey. This system turned the simple act of public speaking into a profound ritual of power. It created a direct, unmediated channel from the ruler to the ruled, bypassing any potential for misinterpretation that might come from a written text in a largely illiterate society. The voice carried nuance, emotion, and immediacy. In this context, hearing was not a passive act, it was an active form of submission. By stopping to listen, the citizen was acknowledging the authority of the speaker and the message. The town crier, in his vibrant uniform and with his projected voice, was a walking reminder that the law was not an abstract concept locked away in a ledger. It was a living force spoken into existence each day, and its sound was the sound of control itself. These formidable walls of stone and mortar did far more than simply block an army's advance. They acted as massive acoustic filters, meticulously defining what could be heard and by whom. The city gate, that crucial point of entry and exit, was the most potent symbol of this sonic control. Its opening and closing were never silent affairs. The gatekeeper, a key agent of urban authority, wielded a horn or a distinct bell to announce these moments with ceremonial gravity. The sound of the gate swinging open at dawn was a signal of opportunity and commerce, a call to farmers, merchants, and travelers that the city was ready to receive them. But the evening signal, that same horn blaring or bell tolling to mark the gate's closing, carried a much heavier meaning. It was the final, absolute deadline. To be caught outside after that sound meant being shut out from safety, community, and commerce until the next morning, a terrifying prospect that made everyone acutely aware of the gatekeeper's power over their freedom of movement. This control extended to a constant, vigilant monitoring of the sounds emanating from beyond the walls. Watchmen stationed on the ramparts were trained not just to look for threats, but to listen for them. The distant, rhythmic thunder of marching feet or the metallic clatter of an approaching armed force carried for miles across the open countryside, providing an early auditory warning system long before any enemy banner came into view. Conversely, the familiar jingle of a merchant's cart or the cheerful singing of pilgrims created a very different sound profile, one that signaled welcome trade and social connection. The city's ears were always pricked, constantly interpreting the external soundscape to distinguish between danger and opportunity, effectively turning the horizon itself into an audible frontier. Inside the walls, a different kind of acoustic engineering took place. The very design of the city helped contain and manage internal noise to prevent chaos and maintain social order. The racket of blacksmiths' hammers, the clamor of livestock markets, and the general din of dense urban life were largely kept within their designated districts. This containment wasn't just about peace and quiet. It was about preventing the spread of unrest. A riotous crowd's shouts or the sounds of a brewing fight could be more easily identified, located, and quashed if they didn't bleed indiscriminately into the residential quarters of the elite or the sacred quiet of monastic grounds. The walls and the tightly packed buildings within them created natural sound buffers and channels, allowing authorities to keep a figurative ear on the city's emotional pulse. This created a powerful psychological dichotomy for the medieval citizen. The world outside the walls was a vast, unpredictable, and often noisy wilderness full of the unknown sounds of forests, bandits, and distant armies. The world inside, however, was a realm of managed, interpreted, and authorized sound. The contrast was stark and intentional. Returning to the city after a journey meant re-entering a familiar auditory landscape where every significant noise had a known source and an understood meaning. This sonic difference reinforced the idea that the city was not just a physical refuge, but a curated acoustic space, a bubble of audibly enforced order amidst a chaotic world. It subtly taught every resident that true safety was found within earshot of the authorities who could interpret, command, and control the very sounds that surrounded them, making the auditory border as real and tangible as the stone one. And just as the spoken word could command a crowd, music provided an even more potent emotional language for those in power. In the halls of a royal court, the sound of music was never mere entertainment. It was auditory propaganda, a calculated display of wealth, sophistication, and absolute authority. When a visiting dignitary arrived, their welcome was not a simple greeting but a multi-sensory assault designed to overwhelm and impress. Trumpet fanfares would blast from the battlements the moment the visitor's party was sighted, a triumphant sound that served two purposes. It announced the guest's importance to the entire city, while simultaneously reminding them of the host's military might. These fanfares were not random notes. They were specific, recognizable sequences known as tucket calls, unique to a particular noble house or kingdom. Hearing that specific melody was like seeing a coat of arms made of sound, an immediate declaration of identity and power that everyone understood. Inside the castle, the musical engineering continued. A great hall's acoustics were often designed to amplify certain instruments. During a feast, the music would be carefully programmed to reflect the ruler's agenda. Soaring, harmonious compositions might celebrate a recent victory or a dynastic marriage, directly linking the ruler's success to a feeling of grandeur and joy experienced by everyone in the room. More somber, religiously themed pieces could be played to frame the monarch as a pious, divinely ordained leader. Composers were, in effect, employees of the state, and their creations were expected to glorify their patron. A new piece of music commemorating a battle wasn't just art. It was a historical record set to melody, ensuring the official version of events was the one that stuck in people's minds and was hummed in the streets. This use of music extended powerfully into the religious realm, where it became a tool for spiritual mobilization. The great cathedrals and churches were Europe's largest and most resonant indoor spaces, and the clergy filled them with sound to breathtaking effect. The complex polyphonic chants of monks, rising and intertwining in the vast stone vaults, were designed to create a sense of awe and divine presence that was utterly overwhelming. This was not music for casual enjoyment. It was an architectural and acoustic demonstration of the church's reach, a sonic representation of a heavenly order that demanded reverence and submission. During public processions on holy days, the entire city became a stage. The clergy, nobility, and guilds would parade through the streets in a precise hierarchy, each group accompanied by their own specific musicians and hymns. The route was meticulously planned to pass through every major district, ensuring the sound of pious chanting and solemn instruments washed over the entire population, reinforcing the church's central role in every aspect of life, from the spiritual to the economic. But what of the common musician, the lone minstrel with a lute or the traveling piper? Even they were ensnared in this web of sonic control. In most medieval cities, to perform music in public for money required an official license from the local authorities or a guild. These licenses were not easily obtained. A musician would have to demonstrate their skill and, more importantly, prove their repertoire was appropriate. Songs that satirized the ruling class, questioned religious doctrine, or recounted the exploits of popular outlaws were strictly forbidden. Unlicensed musicians faced expulsion, fines, or even having their instrument confiscated. This system effectively turned every street performance into an unofficial arm of state propaganda. The songs that echoed through the taverns and squares were those that had passed a silent censor, subtly shaping public sentiment towards loyalty and conformity. The joyous strum of a lute on a street corner, therefore, was rarely an expression of pure artistic freedom. It was often a sound that had been permitted, even encouraged, because it helped maintain the existing order by keeping people content and distracted. Through these layers of control, from the grand court fanfare to the licensed street ballad, music became one of the most effective tools for shaping hearts and minds, proving that a melody could be just as commanding as a law. But the performance of justice did not begin in the courtroom. It started with a sound that echoed across the rooftops. The courthouse bell was a voice of command, its unique tone and rhythm instantly recognizable to every city dweller. When it rang out, it was not a request but a summons, a compulsory call for citizens to gather and bear witness. This auditory command transformed a legal proceeding into a communal event, ensuring that the authority of the court was not exercised in secret but before the eyes and ears of the entire community. The sound of that bell created a captive audience, pulling people from their workshops and homes to participate in a ritual where they were both spectators and subjects, reminded that the law's reach was universal and inescapable. Inside the courtroom, the acoustics of power were meticulously staged. The judge's bench was often elevated, not just for a better view, but so his voice would project with greater force and clarity over the assembled crowd. The strike of his gavel was a sharp, percussive sound that cut through murmurs and objections, a sonic symbol of order being imposed onto potential chaos. Every word he uttered, the reading of charges, the interrogation of witnesses, the final pronouncement of a verdict, was delivered with a deliberate gravity meant to be heard by all. The architecture of these spaces often amplified his voice, making it seem to emanate from the very walls, a physical manifestation of the law's impersonal and overwhelming authority. The accused, by contrast, often stood in a lower position, their voice struggling to be heard, their testimony literally and figuratively diminished by the sonic design of the space. Yet the true auditory impact of medieval justice was reserved for the public square. A guilty verdict was merely the prelude. The sentence was a carefully orchestrated public spectacle designed to resonate far beyond the individual being punished. The sounds of punishment were a brutal symphony intended to educate and terrorize the populace. The heavy, metallic clank of iron chains and manacles being fastened created a chilling soundtrack as a prisoner was led to the stocks or pillory. The sharp, sickening crack of the lash during a public whipping was not just felt by the condemned but heard by the crowd, each stroke a visceral audio cue driving home the price of transgression. These sounds were deliberately public, ensuring that the community did not just see justice being done, but heard its harsh, uncompromising reality. The crowd itself became an unwitting instrument in this theater of power. Their reactions, the collective gasp at a severe sentence, the roar of approval or derision, the sometimes uneasy silence that followed a particularly brutal act, were all part of the performance. Authorities understood that communal participation, even as spectators, created a form of social complicity. By cheering the punishment of a thief, the crowd was audibly reinforcing the very property laws that protected the wealthy. By jeering a heretic, they were vocally affirming the power of the church. The sounds of the mob were channeled and manipulated to validate the actions of the ruling class, turning public opinion into an echo chamber for authority. The most extreme sentences, public executions, were the crescendo of this sonic control. The procession to the gallows or scaffold was a somber parade, often accompanied by the slow, mournful beating of a drum or the tolling of a single bell. This funereal music served a crucial psychological purpose. It framed an act of violent state power as a solemn, even sacred, duty. The sound stripped the event of any sense of chaotic vengeance and instead presented it as the inevitable, regretful conclusion of justice. The silence that was demanded just before the executioner performed his duty was perhaps the most powerful sound of all, a held breath from hundreds of people, a collective anticipation that magnified the horror and finality of the moment. The thud of the trapdoor or the crackle of flames was the period at the end of the sentence, a sound meant to echo in the memory of every witness as a permanent deterrent. Through this masterful manipulation of noise and quiet, medieval justice was not just seen but deeply heard, using the human ear as a direct pathway to the conscience and the fear of those it sought to control. Yet this profound silence was far more than a simple absence of noise. It was a meticulously engineered environment, a spiritual technology designed to shape the soul. Within the high stone walls of a monastery, the rule of silence was absolute and all-encompassing. For the monks and nuns who had taken holy vows, speaking was permitted only in designated areas at specific times and often only with special permission from a superior. Even then, communication was frequently reduced to a complex language of hand signals, a subtle flick of the fingers to request bread at mealtime, a specific gesture to indicate a needed tool in the scriptorium. This extreme auditory restraint served a dual purpose, one spiritual and one profoundly practical. On the surface, it was the path to divine connection, a way to turn one's attention inward and listen for the voice of God by shutting out the distracting chatter of the world. It fostered a state of constant prayer and contemplation, making every action, from copying a manuscript to tending the garden, a silent act of worship. But beneath this sacred surface lay a powerful mechanism of social control. By eliminating casual speech, the monastic authorities, the abbot or abbess eliminated the primary vehicle for grumbling, conspiracy, and dissent. It is incredibly difficult to organize any form of resistance, or even to simply complain about your conditions when you cannot speak without express permission. This enforced quietude rigorously maintained the strict hierarchical order of the religious community. A novice understood their place not just through bows and rituals, but through the very sound of their own, or rather, their lack of voice in the presence of their elders. Disputes could not escalate into arguments, criticisms could not be openly voiced. Silence became the glue that held the hierarchy together, ensuring obedience was as constant and pervasive as the quiet itself. The architecture of these spaces was deliberately crafted to enhance this feeling of sacred separation through sound, or the lack thereof. The cloister, a covered walkway surrounding a peaceful garden courtyard, was the heart of the monastic complex and was always a zone of absolute silence. Its design was a masterpiece of acoustic isolation. The thick stone walls and arched walkways acted as a buffer, swallowing any stray sounds from the outside world and creating a hushed interior world apart. Stepping from a noisy medieval street into the cloister was like stepping into another realm entirely, a world of stillness and order that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic din of secular life. This dramatic contrast was not an accident. It was a key part of the Church's mystique and authority. It visually and audibly demonstrated that the religious life was different, higher, and more disciplined, a state of being that required special rules and granted special access to the divine. And the consequences for breaking this sacred silence were severe and immediate. A whispered conversation overheard in the wrong corridor, an outburst of laughter in the refectory, or even the careless clatter of a dish could be met with penance. Punishments ranged from extra prayers and fasting to physical discipline or public humiliation before the entire chapter. These weren't merely corrections for breaking a rule, they were powerful lessons in discipline. Each penalty reinforced the idea that controlling one's tongue was directly linked to controlling one's soul, and that obedience to the rule of silence was synonymous with obedience to God and his earthly representatives. The message was clear: in the economy of salvation, quietude was a form of currency, and frivolous speech was a wasteful extravagance. This monastic model of sonic control didn't just stay behind the monastery walls, it radiated outward, influencing the broader perception of the church's power. Lay people who visited these spaces or who interacted with silently disciplined clergy came away with a reinforced impression of the church's otherworldly authority. The ability to command such profound silence from hundreds of individuals was seen as a testament to a divine power that mere secular rulers could not hope to emulate. It proved that the church could control not just actions, but the most fundamental human impulses: to speak, to connect, to complain. In this way, the silent monasteries and convents became living advertisements for the potency of spiritual authority, demonstrating that true power could be exercised not through the commanding shout, but through the expectant and utterly controlled hush. But when the peaceful rhythm of daily bells was shattered by the cry of "to arms," the entire acoustic landscape of the city was instantly repurposed for a single, terrifying objective: survival. In that moment, the familiar soundscape transformed into a sophisticated military communications network, engineered to turn raw panic into disciplined action. The watchman stationed in the highest tower, his eyes scanning the horizon, was the first line of defense, and his lungs were as vital as any weapon. Spotting a column of distant dust or the glint of armor, he wouldn't just ring a bell randomly. He would unleash a pre-arranged, frantic sequence of strikes, a rapid, staccato alarm that was utterly different from the measured tolling for mass or curfew. This specific sound pattern was a key that unlocked a city-wide drill practiced by every able-bodied citizen. It was a sound that froze hearts and then propelled bodies into motion, triggering an instantaneous and coordinated response honed through repetition. The genius of this system lay in its auditory specificity. A single, continuous bell might signal a fire, sending citizens scrambling to form bucket lines at the wells. But the urgent, alternating peals between the great church bell and a secondary watch bell meant only one thing: human threat. Even more nuanced were the signals from the battlements. A deep, resonant blast from a great horn or oliphant, an instrument made from an actual elephant tusk, often signified the approach of a recognized noble or a friendly force, a sound of alert but not alarm. Conversely, a series of short, sharp blasts from a smaller horn or a cornet indicated immediate and imminent danger, likely an attacking force already at the gates. This auditory code allowed for a graduated response. There was no need to fully mobilize the city militia for a band of marauding outlaws that the gate guards could handle, but the distinct sound of a full-scale assault would bring every man to the walls with whatever weapon they could grab. This immediate, visceral reaction was only possible because of the relentless drilling that characterized life in a frontier or frequently threatened city. Local ordinances often required all households to have someone participate in these drills, ensuring that the response to each specific sound was almost reflexive. Upon hearing the invasion alarm, blacksmiths would drop their hammers and head to pre-assigned defensive positions along the walls. Farmers outside the gates would abandon their fields and drive their livestock toward the city, hoping to make it inside before the gates slammed shut. Women and children had their own roles, often preparing boiling water or lime to pour on attackers, or readying themselves to tend to the wounded. The entire community became a single organism, its movements directed not by a general shouting orders that few could hear, but by the pervasive, commanding sounds emanating from the towers that loomed over every street. This collective action, triggered by sound, forged a powerful and unique social bond, a collective identity under siege. In that moment of shared, audible fear, the usual social divisions of class, trade, and status could momentarily blur. The rich merchant stood shoulder to shoulder with the apprentice, both listening to the same alarm, both facing the same existential threat. This unifying effect was a powerful tool for urban authorities. By controlling the alarms, they could channel the natural fear of the populace into a structured, communal effort that reinforced their own leadership. The chaos of a potential sack was replaced with a sense of purpose and order, all orchestrated through sound. The message was clear: in the face of destruction, our only hope is to listen and act together, and the ones who control the signals are the ones who ensure our survival. The sonic command of the war alarm thus did more than just warn. It organized, it unified, and it legitimized the authority of those who held the horns and rang the bells, proving that in times of crisis, the most powerful weapon could be a well-understood sound. This auditory stratification meant that your social standing wasn't just visible in your clothing or your home. It was something you and everyone else could literally hear. Step into the wealthy quarter of any medieval city, and you would immediately notice a different acoustic atmosphere. The homes of nobles and rich merchants were often built with thicker stone walls, larger interior courtyards, and gardens that acted as natural sound buffers. Their windows might be glazed with expensive glass, not just for warmth, but to keep the clamor of the outside world at bay. Inside these insulated halls, the soundscape was one of curated pleasure. A noble family might employ a private minstrel or a small ensemble of musicians to perform during meals or gatherings. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a conspicuous display of wealth. The ability to command beautiful, exclusive music within one's own home, to create a private bubble of harmonious sound, was a powerful status symbol. It audibly demonstrated that one was above the raucous, unpredictable noise of the common world, living in a refined environment of their own making. Conversely, the experience of the common majority was a relentless immersion in a shared, chaotic symphony of survival. The narrow, crowded streets where artisans and laborers lived were a constant cacophony of necessity. From before dawn, the air was filled with the relentless hammering of the blacksmith, the rhythmic scraping of the woodturner's lathe, the splashing and shouting from the communal well, and the incessant clamor of livestock kept in backyards. There was no privacy from sound. Arguments, celebrations, sickness, and death all played out in an audible public arena. This constant din was more than just an inconvenience, it was a marker of class. To be surrounded by noise was to be identified as part of the laboring masses, whose lives were lived in public, subject to the auditory scrutiny of their neighbors and the authorities. The sound of your environment announced your place in the social order as clearly as any heraldic crest. The authorities didn't merely observe this acoustic divide, they actively enforced it through legislation, creating official, quiet zones that protected the sensibilities and the power of the elite. It was common for medieval town councils to pass laws specifically prohibiting certain noisy activities near the residences of important figures or in designated upper-class districts. A blacksmith might be forbidden from operating his noisy forge too close to a monastery or a nobleman's house. Street vendors could be banned from crying their wares in certain squares or lanes, preserving the tranquility of those who lived there. These laws were selectively applied and punished, clearly demonstrating who had the privilege to control the sound around them. A nobleman's complaint about a disruptive tanner would be swiftly acted upon, while the tanner's own complaints about the all-night revelry coming from the noble's estate would likely be ignored. This unequal enforcement of noise ordinances made the power structure audibly clear. The right to quiet was a luxury afforded only to the influential. This control extended beyond mere peace and quiet. It was about controlling the very narrative of the city. The sounds of power, the church bells, the town crier's proclamations, the fanfares from the castle, were permitted to penetrate every neighborhood from the grandest to the most humble. These were the authorized sounds, the noises that reinforced the official order. In contrast, the sounds of popular dissent or unauthorized celebration were quickly suppressed. A spontaneous parade of apprentices or a raucous folk celebration that spilled into a well-to-do street could be shut down for disturbing the peace, its participants punished. This created a world where the sanctioned sounds of authority were inescapable, while the organic sounds of the populace were kept in their designated, noisy quarters. The city's soundscape became a map of control, with the powerful regulating not just where people lived and worked, but what they were forced to hear and what they were forbidden from making heard. In this environment, the ultimate symbol of status was not just wealth or land, but the sovereign power to command silence itself. This control over the city's soundscape extended even into the realm of grievance, where the very act of complaining about noise revealed the stark contours of power and privilege. In the crowded, bustling environment of a medieval city, noise was an unavoidable fact of life, but the right to object to it was anything but universal. The elite nobles, wealthy merchants, high-ranking clergy held an exclusive entitlement to peace and quiet, a privilege they actively defended. A guildmaster trying to concentrate on his accounts, a canon attempting to pray in his private chambers, or a noblewoman seeking afternoon repose could formally petition the town council against the disruptive clamor emanating from a blacksmith's forge, a bustling tavern, or a group of rowdy apprentices. These were not mere suggestions, they were powerful demands from the city's most influential citizens, and they were almost always heeded. The result was a web of specific, localized ordinances that created acoustic sanctuaries for the powerful. A tanner might be ordered to relocate his malodorous and noisy workshop from a street bordering the cathedral close. A butcher could be forbidden from slaughtering animals before dawn near a wealthy residential quarter. These rulings carved out islands of enforced tranquility within the urban din, audibly marking the neighborhoods of the elite as zones of protected quiet. Conversely, the authorized sounds of authority enjoyed near total immunity from complaint, creating a glaring double standard that reinforced the social order. The relentless, ear-splitting clangor of the blacksmith's hammer might be deemed a nuisance worthy of regulation, but the thunderous, daily pealing of the church bells, often just as loud and disruptive, was considered a sacred and non-negotiable element of civic life. A town crier shouting official proclamations under one's window at an inconvenient hour was performing a civic duty, not creating a disturbance. The blaring fanfares announcing a noble's arrival or the rhythmic marching of the city watch were sounds of power, and to complain about them would be tantamount to questioning authority itself. This protected status transformed these sounds into a form of acoustic imperialism, constantly reminding the lower classes that the noises of power had a right to invade their space, while their own essential, livelihood-driven sounds could be deemed illegal trespass in the wrong part of town. This selective enforcement meant that the authorities, the very same council members who were often the ones complaining, held the ultimate power to define what constituted acceptable and unacceptable sound. Their judgments were rarely about objective volume levels and almost always about social hierarchy and cultural prejudice. The boisterous singing of a drinking song from a common tavern was classified as a disruptive brawl needing suppression, while the equally loud, refined music from a noble's banquet was celebrated as culture. The sound of artisans working late to meet a deadline could be punished, but the ringing of bells for a mandatory midnight mass was a holy obligation. This arbitrary control over the auditory environment taught a powerful lesson: that the lifestyles and necessities of the elite were inherently valuable and deserving of protection, while the lives and labors of the common people were inherently disruptive and subject to restriction. The soundscape itself became a moral and social map, with good and bad noises defined not by their acoustic properties but by the social status of their source. Ultimately, the politics of medieval noise complaints reveal that the privilege of being heard was just as important as the power to make noise. A beggar's shouts for alms or a street vendor's cry could be silenced for disturbing the peace, their voices deemed unworthy of public space. But the petition of a wealthy burgher, delivered on parchment and presented before the council, carried immense weight. The system was designed to listen to the powerful and ignore the powerless. This auditory bias ensured that the soundscape evolved not according to the needs of the many, but to the comforts and demands of the few. It was a subtle yet profoundly effective way of naturalizing inequality, making it seem right and proper that some citizens could command silence while others were condemned to a life of noise, their voices and their grievances fading into the background din of the city they helped build. Yet even within this meticulously controlled auditory world, the disempowered found their own voice in the absence of sound, mastering a subtle art of quiet subversion. For those on the margins of medieval society, peasants living under the thumb of a harsh lord, religious minorities facing persecution, or women navigating a deeply patriarchal world, open defiance was often a shortcut to punishment or worse. So instead of shouting their dissent, they learned to weaponize silence itself. In the dead of night, away from the watchman's patrols and the ever-listening walls of the elite quarters, secret meetings were held in cellars, forest clearings, or remote barns. These gatherings were conducted in the most careful of hushed tones, where a whispered plan or a quietly shared piece of forbidden knowledge became an act of profound rebellion. This wasn't merely being quiet, it was the creation of a counter-sphere, a hidden acoustic territory where the official narratives of power could be questioned and alternative futures could be imagined, all beneath the radar of those who sought to control every decibel. This resistance took on public forms as well, in the brilliant and daring strategy of the silent protest. Imagine the potency of a community that, when forced to gather to hear a new oppressive decree from the town crier, responded not with the expected grumbles or cheers, but with a unified, stony, and utterly deafening silence. This collective refusal to perform the anticipated auditory feedback, the lack of gasps, the absence of murmurs of assent, the void where the sounds of submission should have been, was a powerful and unnerving act of defiance. It stripped the authority of its validating soundtrack, leaving its pronouncements hanging in a void of non-acceptance. For rulers whose power was partially performative, reliant on the audible compliance of the crowd, this silent treatment was deeply destabilizing. It was a way to say, "We hear you, but we do not agree," without uttering a single punishable word. Perhaps the most enduring form of this quiet resistance was the cultural preservation undertaken by marginalized groups. For communities whose languages, songs, and stories were banned by conquering powers or a dominant religious orthodoxy, the home became a sanctuary of suppressed sound. Behind closed doors and under the cover of night, parents would whisper ancient folktales to their children in a forbidden tongue, or hum the melodies of songs that could not be sung aloud in the public square. These were not grand gestures, but they were vital acts of cultural survival. Each hushed lullaby, each quietly recited poem, was a defiant act of memory, ensuring that the identity of a people was not erased by the loud proclamations of those in power. This underground auditory life created a parallel world of meaning, a hidden heritage passed from one generation to the next in careful, loving secrecy, proving that the most powerful sounds are sometimes those that are never heard by the authorities at all. These acts of sonic rebellion reveal a crucial truth about power. It is never absolute. The very tools of control, in this case, the enforcement of certain sounds and the prohibition of others, can be flipped and used against the controller. By mastering the art of unheard communication, the disempowered carved out spaces of autonomy within a system designed to leave them none. They demonstrated that resistance isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's a deliberate and strategic silence, a refusal to participate in the acoustic performance of power. This quiet defiance reminds us that the dynamics of control are a constant negotiation, a two-way street where even the most engineered environment contains cracks where freedom can quietly take root and grow. But the medieval soundscape was not solely a human creation. It was a chorus that included the indispensable voices of the animal kingdom, and these too were harnessed and managed as instruments of control. The barks and growls of watchdogs, for instance, were not random disturbances but a highly valued part of the urban security apparatus. A wealthy merchant's home or a monastery storage yard was often protected by specially trained guard dogs, and their sharp, sudden barking in the night was a trusted alarm system. This sound triggered an immediate response from the household or the night watch, transforming an animal's instinct into a sanctioned signal of intrusion. The authority of the watchman was thus amplified by the keen ears of his canine partners, creating a hybrid system of surveillance where the natural world was enlisted to protect the social order. The barking of a dog was not just noise. In the right context, it was the first line of acoustic defense, a sound that commanded attention and prompted action from those in charge. Beyond the city walls, the relationship between sound, animals, and power took on a more aristocratic tone with the elaborate tradition of the hunt. The hunting horn was not a simple noisemaker. It was a sophisticated musical instrument with its own complex language, used exclusively by the nobility and their trained huntsmen. Each specific sequence of notes conveyed a precise message to the hunting party. One melody announced the sighting of the quarry, another signaled that the hounds had picked up the scent, and yet another called for the assembly of the hunters. These sounds echoed through the royal forests, which were themselves legally enforced zones of quiet where commoners were forbidden from disturbing the game. The triumphant blast of the horn following a kill was not just a celebration, it was a sonic proclamation of elite prowess and territorial dominance. For the peasants working nearby, the distant, haunting calls of these horns were a constant auditory reminder of the noble privilege that governed the land and everything on it, turning the natural soundscape into a backdrop for displays of social power. Back within the bustling city, the authorities faced the constant challenge of managing the less glamorous but ever-present sounds of livestock and stray animals. The daily movement of herds to and from pasture outside the gates was a major source of urban noise, with the bellowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, and the shouts of drovers creating a predictable twice-daily cacophony. While this was often tolerated as a necessity, town councils frequently passed laws to control its timing and route, ensuring the disruption to the sleep or peace of more influential citizens was minimized. Stray animals, however, represented a breakdown of this acoustic order. A dog howling incessantly in an alley or a pig rooting through the streets and squealing was not merely a nuisance. It was a challenge to civic peace and a potential trigger for larger disturbances. Animal control officers, often called dog whippers or similar titles, were empowered to seize these noisy offenders, and their owners could be fined. This removal of disruptive animal sounds was framed as a public service, but it was fundamentally an exercise in maintaining an auditory environment conducive to authority and commerce, proving that even the most natural of sounds were subject to human regulation. This control reached its most organized form in the designated livestock markets. These areas were sonic hotspots, a roaring, clattering, and squawking chaos that authorities worked hard to contain within specific hours and specific parts of the city. Market officials enforced strict rules on the conduct of salesmen and drovers, punishing those whose shouting matches or whose treatment of animals caused excessive uproar. The goal was to prevent the market's natural din from spilling over into the broader city and escalating into a full-blown riot or panic. By corralling the sounds of animal commerce, the powers that be demonstrated their ability to impose structure even on the most primal noises, turning a potential source of chaos into a regulated and therefore profitable enterprise. The management of these animal soundscapes, from the loyal bark of a watchdog to the controlled bedlam of the cattle market, shows how medieval power extended its reach beyond the human world, seeking to orchestrate every aspect of the audible environment to create a world where even the animals, willingly or not, played their part in the symphony of control. Beyond the visual splendor of fluttering banners and painted shields, medieval power cultivated a rich and equally potent auditory identity, a world where your allegiance and status were announced not just by what people saw, but by what they heard. The battlefield was a cauldron of deafening chaos, the clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, the general roar of combat. In that maelstrom, visual identification was often impossible. This is where the battle cry became an essential acoustic lifeline and a weapon of psychological warfare. A knight would bellow his family's distinctive cry, a short, guttural phrase like "a lion rampant." For the Douglas clan or St. George for England, this wasn't just a shout, it was a sonic beacon for his followers, a way to coordinate and rally his men amidst the confusion. More than that, it was a declaration of identity and intent, a sound meant to instill fear in his enemies by announcing exactly who was coming for them. This cry was the oral equivalent of his coat of arms, a heraldic symbol made of sound that could be heard over the din, binding his followers together and marking his presence on the field as clearly as any flag. This concept of acoustic identity extended into the more choreographed violence of the tournament. The joust was a grand theatrical spectacle of power, and its soundtrack was meticulously composed. Before the thunderous charge down the lists, a herald would step forward and, with a voice trained for maximum projection, would shout the knight's motto to the assembled crowd. This motto was often a pithy, defiant phrase that encapsulated the family's values or its divine right to rule. Hearing "De et mon droit," God and my right, for the English king, or Montjoy Saint Denis. For the French, instantly communicated a complex web of lineage, loyalty, and ambition to every listener, regardless of their literacy. The crowd's roar in response to these cries became part of the performance, an audible measure of a knight's popularity, and by extension, his political power. The tournament grounds became a stage where the social order was not just displayed but sounded out for all to hear and understand. The control over these powerful auditory symbols was as strict as the laws governing their visual counterparts. The right to use a specific battle cry or musical motif was a legally protected privilege, often granted by a monarch or earned through great deeds. For a low-born soldier to arrogantly shout the cry of a great noble house on the battlefield was an act of unforgivable presumption, a kind of acoustic treason that could be punished severely. This regulation ensured that the soundscape of power remained ordered and legible. Just as you could look at a shield and know who stood before you, you could hear a cry or a specific fanfare and know your place in the hierarchy, whether to bow, to follow, or to flee. This system prevented the chaos of sonic impersonation, ensuring that the authority conveyed by these sounds remained authentic and unchallenged. This fusion of sound and symbol reached its most refined form in the development of personalized musical motifs for powerful families and rulers. A particular trumpet fanfare or a distinctive drum pattern would become so intimately associated with a specific duke, king, or bishop that it functioned as an auditory logo. Hearing those specific notes played from the battlements as a lord approached his castle announced his return with a grandeur that words alone could never achieve. It told the butcher in the shop, the weaver at her loom, and the monk in the scriptory exactly who was entering the gates, conditioning their response before he even came into view. This immediate, visceral recognition deepened the impact of authority on the collective consciousness, weaving power into the very fabric of daily life through a shared auditory experience. It made allegiance a feeling, a reaction triggered by sound, proving that the most effective control often speaks directly to the ear, bypassing the eye and the critical mind to resonate on a far more instinctive level. This manipulation of sound through stone and space was a deliberate and sophisticated art, a form of psychological architecture where the very physics of echo and resonance were bent to serve authority. Consider the awe-inspiring vastness of a Gothic cathedral. Those soaring vaulted ceilings and expansive stone walls were not merely an aesthetic choice to reach toward the heavens. They were an acoustic engine designed to generate a sense of the divine. When a priest or bishop delivered a sermon, his words wouldn't just travel in a straight line to the congregation. They would swirl upward, bouncing off the stone pillars and arches, blending into a long, lingering reverberation that could last for several seconds. This sonic effect transformed a single human voice into something ethereal and overwhelming. The message wasn't coming from just a man. It seemed to emanate from the building itself, from the very atmosphere, imbuing the religious doctrine with an otherworldly power that felt innate and unquestionable. The slight delay and wash of sound made the speaker seem less human and more like a conduit for a higher power, his authority amplified not by a microphone, but by the masterful engineering of sacred space. This wasn't just preaching, it was full immersion auditory persuasion. Secular rulers were just as cunning in their use of architectural acoustics to command respect and fear. The throne room was a stage for power, and its design ensured the lead actor always had the best acoustics. Builders would employ subtle techniques to create what we might now think of as an early directional sound system. A domed or barrel-vaulted ceiling directly above the throne could be shaped to catch the ruler's voice and project it forward, giving it a fuller, more resonant quality that carried to the far end of the hall. Meanwhile, the same architectural features might be used to dissipate and muffle the voices of those who approach to petition or speak. Their words might get lost in the hard surfaces, sounding weaker and less assured, creating an immediate and subconscious power imbalance before a single substantive word was even exchanged. The message was clear in the very sound of the conversation. One voice was meant to be heard and obeyed, while the others were merely tolerated. This engineering of intimidation extended to the more mundane passages of power. The long, stone-flagged corridor leading to a noble's private chambers or a council meeting room was rarely just a convenient hallway. Its narrow, parallel walls and high ceiling were perfect for creating a pronounced, slapping echo with every footstep. A visitor's approach would be announced by a cascading series of echoes that made a single person sound like a small marching troop. This auditory illusion served a powerful psychological purpose. It created a sense of anticipation and anxiety, making the visitor feel exposed and outnumbered before they even entered the room. Conversely, for the ruler waiting within, it provided an early auditory warning system and a subtle reminder of their control over the environment. Even the approach to their presence was a curated experience designed to unsettle and diminish the confidence of anyone who entered. The architecture itself became a silent guard, using sound to amplify the aura of the authority it housed. This conscious design shows a profound understanding of how sound shapes human emotion and perception. Medieval architects and their patrons were intuitive physicists and psychologists, recognizing that the experience of a space is not just visual. They knew that a long echo could inspire spiritual awe, that a well-projected voice could sound more convincing, and that the disorienting effect of unseen footsteps could breed fear and submission. They turned their buildings into instruments, and the people within became both the players and the audience in a carefully composed symphony of power. In these spaces, authority didn't just reside in the person of the king or bishop. It was baked into the stones, whispered by the echoes, and felt in the very marrow of those who listened, proving that the most effective control often operates not through what is seen, but through what is heard and felt in the surrounding silence. Think of the most powerful memories in your own life, and chances are they're tied to specific sounds, a song from your youth, a particular bell that marked the end of the school day, the familiar whistle of a parent calling you home. Medieval authorities understood this connection intuitively, and they harnessed it with remarkable sophistication. Sound became the primary needle and thread used to stitch the fabric of social memory, weaving the present moment into a tapestry of seemingly timeless tradition. This wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about actively shaping a collective identity where the current power structure felt as natural and unchanging as the seasons, all through the strategic use of repetitive, ritualistic noise. Consider the profound impact of annual festivals. These weren't simply days off for merrymaking. They were highly choreographed auditory experiences designed to reinforce a specific historical narrative. On the feast day of a city's patron saint, the entire populace would be treated to a very specific sequence of sounds. First, the unique, joyous pealing of the church bells, a pattern heard only on that one day each year. Then the procession through the streets, led by clergy and officials singing a hymn that told the story of the saints' miracles and their special protection over the city. The crowd, knowing the words by heart from a lifetime of repetition, would join in. This collective singing was a powerful act of acoustic unity. With every verse, the participants weren't just honoring a religious figure. They were vocally reaffirming their shared identity as citizens under divine and civic protection. The message embedded in the melody was clear. We are all part of this story, and this story justifies the world as it is. The same principle applied to more secular anniversaries. The birthday of a founding monarch or the date of a crucial military victory would be marked by the ringing of bells in a triumphant, specific cadence. Town criers would deliver proclamations that recounted the event in glowing, heroic terms, their voices echoing the official version of history. Over years and decades, these sounds became inextricably linked to the emotions of pride and security. To hear that particular bell pattern was to feel a sense of belonging and to subconsciously accept the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty that the celebration upheld. This sonic conditioning made the political structure feel less like a human invention and more like a natural law, as regular and dependable as the annual return of a familiar song. This auditory reinforcement of memory served a crucial political purpose. It made the existing power structure feel inevitable. By constantly linking their authority to these deep, resonant traditions through sound, rulers and the church framed any challenge to their power as not just treasonous, but as a kind of cultural sacrilege. To question the Duke was to disrespect the founding victory hymn. To argue for new laws was to ignore the wisdom embedded in the ancient chants. The sounds of tradition created an invisible fortress around the status quo, defending it with the potent emotional weight of memory and shared identity. Innovation could be made to sound dissonant and unnatural, while the familiar melodies of the past, even if they reinforced inequality, sounded like harmony itself. Through this brilliant, repetitive orchestration, the past was never truly allowed to be past. It was made audibly present every single year, every season, in every familiar bell and chant. This constant sonic invocation rendered power familiar, comfortable, and seemingly preordained. The authority of the lord, the bishop, or the guildmaster was not presented as a temporary arrangement but as an eternal truth, echoing through the streets and ringing in the ears of every citizen from childhood to old age. The soundscape itself became a living history book, one that everyone could subconsciously read, ensuring that the official story was the only story that ever truly resonated. But beneath the grand public performances of power in the shadowy corners of the medieval world, a different kind of authority thrived, one that relied not on commanding sound, but on mastering its absolute absence. For every bell that tolled to gather a crowd, there was a whispered conversation meant for a single ear. The most potent decisions, the most dangerous plots, and the most delicate manipulations were not conducted in the open air, but in a carefully cultivated void of silence, where confidentiality was the ultimate currency of control. This was the realm of espionage and state secrecy, where what wasn't heard was often far more important than what was. The architecture of power had its hidden acoustic dimensions, specifically designed to contain the most sensitive sounds of statecraft. The council chambers where kings and their advisors debated war, taxation, and succession were often architectural marvels of sound suppression. Tapestries woven with thick, heavy wool were not merely decorative. They acted as primitive but effective acoustic panels, soaking up the reverberations of a raised voice or a heated argument. Behind these tapestries, walls were sometimes stuffed with straw or horsehair, a rudimentary form of insulation that prevented sound from traveling to listening ears in adjacent rooms or corridors. Even the placement of these rooms was strategic, often situated in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of a castle, far from the busy courtyards and great halls. A meeting held in the Oriel Room or a secluded turret chamber was not just about a nice view. It was about creating an acoustic bubble, a sanctum of silence where the fate of realms could be decided without a single word leaking beyond the door. Within these silenced spaces, communication itself took on a covert, almost magical quality. The trusted messenger didn't just carry a letter. He might carry a message encrypted with a cipher known only to a handful of people, its true meaning locked away even if the parchment was intercepted. For matters too sensitive to be written down at all, messages were memorized and delivered in the hushest of tones, face to face in a secluded garden or a confessional booth. The informant or spy became a master of the unheard, blending into the background noise of a tavern just enough to overhear a seditious conversation without being noticed themselves. Their power lay in their ability to gather information without generating any of their own, to be a silent vessel into which secrets could be poured. A dropped coin purse, a seemingly casual bump in a crowded market, these could be the silent signals that initiated a chain of events known only to a select few. This culture of secrecy created a powerful and unsettling duality in medieval governance. The public face of power was all bells, proclamations, and bombastic ceremony, a performance of unity and strength meant for the masses. But its private face was one of whispers, suspicion, and carefully guarded silence. This allowed the elite to operate on two separate tracks, one for the people they ruled and one for themselves. They could publicly proclaim peace while secretly plotting war, or preach piety while privately engaging in ruthless realpolitik. the ability to decide things away from public scrutiny granted them a tremendous advantage, allowing for swift, decisive, and often ruthless action that would have been impossible amidst the noisy deliberations of a larger public forum. It demonstrated a cold, calculating understanding that true control often meant controlling the narrative completely, and that sometimes the most effective way to do that was to ensure there was no narrative at all until the deed was already done. In the silent chambers of power, history was not being announced. It was being written in whispers long before the town crier ever stepped into the square to tell the tale. But this auditory control over the hours was far more than a simple public service. It was a profound and deeply political act that reshaped the very consciousness of the medieval citizen. Before the widespread dominance of the mechanical clock, time was a fluid concept dictated by the sun's arc, the needs of the season, and the natural rhythms of the body. The church bell shattered this organic relationship, replacing it with an artificial, authoritative rhythm that served the interests of power. The sound of the bell did not suggest it commanded. Its toll was an acoustic fence that corralled human activity into neatly defined segments, creating what we might now recognize as the very first standardized workday. The laborer in the field, the weaver at her loom, and the apprentice in the workshop all knew that their toil began not when the dew had dried or when they felt sufficiently rested, but at the precise moment the designated prime or first hour bell echoed across the rooftops. Their midday break and their evening cessation were similarly dictated, their personal autonomy over their own time and energy systematically erased by a sound that brooked no argument. This regimentation created a society of synchronized dependency, where the entire community moved to a single, imposed tempo. The predictability of the bells provided a framework that could be comforting, reducing the uncertainty of daily life and creating a shared routine that bound the community together. But this stability came at a cost, the erosion of self-determination. Generations grew so accustomed to this external prompting that the very idea of structuring one's own day became unimaginable. The bell created a psychological reliance, a conditioned response where initiative was replaced by anticipation. People stopped listening to their own internal clocks and instead waited for the cue from the tower, effectively outsourcing their sense of time to a higher authority. This dependency was a powerful tool of social control, fostering a population that was not only physically compliant, but also mentally conditioned to accept external direction in the most fundamental aspects of their lives. The authority to control this schedule was therefore the authority to control productivity, worship, and leisure, the three pillars of medieval existence. By dictating the hours of work, the church and the ruling class could maximize economic output for their own benefit, ensuring fields were tended and goods were produced on a predictable schedule. By commanding the hours of prayer, they repeatedly inserted themselves as the mandatory intermediary between the individual and the divine, reinforcing their spiritual authority with relentless acoustic regularity. Even leisure and rest were permitted only when the bell declared it was time, framing personal respite not as a right but as a granted privilege. This control transformed time from a shared, natural resource into a commodified instrument of power. The sound of the bell was the audible signature of this ownership, a constant reminder that every moment of a person's life, from their most productive labor to their most humble prayer, was ultimately on loan from the powers that presided over the bell tower. Amidst the grand strategies of sonic power, from the commanding bells of war to the whispered secrets of state, there existed a more humble yet equally vital form of auditory control, one that addressed the most immediate and visceral threat to medieval urban life: filth and disease. The crowded, narrow streets of a medieval city were a constant public health hazard, where the improper disposal of waste could lead to foul odors, contaminated water, and the rapid spread of deadly epidemics. Authorities quickly realized that managing this biological threat was impossible through written decrees alone in a largely illiterate society. They needed to create a soundscape of sanitation, a series of clear, recognizable auditory cues that could direct the daily rituals of urban cleanliness and, in times of crisis, guide a panicked populace toward survival. This system began with the most mundane of sounds, the distinct bell or horn of the rakers or gong farmers, the men responsible for collecting the city's waste. These workers didn't operate on a silent schedule known only to a few. Their approach was a public performance announced well in advance. A specific, often rather mournful clanging or a blast on a horn would echo down the cobbled lanes, a signal as reliable as the workday bell. Upon hearing it, residents knew it was time to bring their household waste ashes from the hearth, food scraps, and most unpleasantly, the contents of their chamber pots, to the street for collection. This auditory prompt transformed a private, individual responsibility into a synchronized civic action. The sound of the waste collector's bell created a shared rhythm for disposal, ensuring that refuse was not left to putrefy in homes or be dumped haphazardly in alleys at all hours. It was a simple, effective way to impose order on the chaos of decay, using sound to choreograph the removal of the city's waste in a way that protected everyone. But the role of sound in public health shifted from routine management to urgent command during the terrifying outbreak of plague or other contagions. In these moments of peak crisis, the town crier's voice became the most critical instrument for survival. His proclamations were no longer about taxes or laws. They were life or death instructions, delivered with a gravity meant to cut through the fog of panic. He would announce the grim news of the disease's arrival in a specific quarter, but more importantly, he would broadcast the authorities' decrees on how to contain it. His cries would outline new, stringent curfews for waste disposal, order the killing of stray dogs and pigs that roamed the streets spreading filth, and mandate the burning of contaminated bedding and clothes. Most crucially, he was the one who announced the dreaded but necessary order of quarantine, his voice declaring which streets or houses were to be sealed off, their doors marked with a cross, their inhabitants forbidden from leaving under penalty of death. In the absence of understanding germ theory, these auditory commands were the primary public health tool, a way to impose a desperate, structured response onto the blind terror of a population watching their neighbors die. This strategic use of sound during epidemics brilliantly reframed the nature of authority itself. The same power that used bells to regiment labor and silence to suppress dissent now used the human voice to deliver what was presented as life-saving care. The line between control and compassion became intentionally blurred. By tying these strict, often harsh, sanitary measures to the collective goal of survival, the ruling class could present itself not as an oppressor, but as a benevolent protector. The crier's voice, once an instrument of tax collection, became the voice of reason in a maelstrom of fear. Obedience was no longer framed merely as a legal requirement. It was now a moral duty, a necessary act of community solidarity. This clever psychological pivot allowed authorities to tighten their control dramatically during crises, enforcing curfews, restricting movement, and mandating behavior under the universally acceptable guise of public health. The sound of the crier during a plague year was the sound of order desperately fighting chaos, and in that fight, the power of the state to dictate the most intimate details of life was profoundly strengthened, all while wearing the mask of a concerned guardian. Yet within this carefully orchestrated soundscape of power, there existed a constant, humming undercurrent of resistance, a dissonant chorus of sounds that those in authority worked relentlessly to silence. For every toll of the church bell that called for order, there might be a whispered joke in a tavern that mocked the bishop. For every town crier's official proclamation, a satirical song might be hummed in the marketplace, its lyrics a thinly veiled critique of a corrupt official. These unauthorized sounds were not merely noise, they were the audible symptoms of dissent, and the medieval establishment possessed a sophisticated and often brutal apparatus dedicated to their suppression. The freedom to make sound to be heard became one of the most fiercely contested battlegrounds between the powerful and the people. Authorities understood that a seditious idea, once given voice, could spread through a population with the speed and potency of a plague. To prevent this, they deployed a corps of official listeners, censors, watchmen, and informants whose ears were constantly pricked for the slightest hint of subversion. These men were not just listening for the content of speech, they were trained to interpret the tone, the context, and the very melody of dissent. A group of apprentices laughing too loudly after curfew might be broken up for a simple disturbance, but that same group singing a song with altered, mocking lyrics about the guildmaster was committing a far more serious political act. The censors knew the difference. They patrolled not just the physical spaces of the city but its acoustic territories, mapping the sounds of the streets and identifying any that deviated from the sanctioned score of daily life. The punishments for creating these forbidden sounds were designed to be as public and humiliating as the acts themselves, serving as a stark auditory warning to others. A street performer caught singing a ballad that satirized the king might find themselves in the stocks, their musical instrument symbolically broken before the crowd. A woman accused of spreading malicious gossip, a form of sonic sedition that could damage reputations and destabilize social order, could be punished with a scold's bridle, a brutal iron muzzle that literally clamped down on her tongue, rendering her not only silent but visibly, painfully so. These punishments were public spectacles because the crime was a public one. The goal was not just to punish the individual but to reassert control over the shared auditory environment, to demonstrate that the authorities had the final say over what could and could not be heard within their domain. This intense repression inevitably transformed the very act of making an unauthorized sound into a courageous declaration of defiance. To sing a forbidden song became more than just singing. It was a political statement, a reclaiming of a small piece of acoustic territory. The absence of such sounds, conversely, was a telling indicator of fear and submission. A marketplace that usually buzzed with lively debate falling into a nervous, watchful silence after a crackdown was a clear sign that authorities' grip had tightened. The battle for the city's soul was therefore waged decibel by decibel. It was a constant push and pull, the power of the bell tower against the power of the whispered rumor, the authority of the herald's cry against the satire of the street singer's chorus. This struggle reveals a profound truth about medieval power dynamics. Control was never absolute. The relentless efforts to police sound prove just how vibrant and persistent this auditory resistance was. The authorities would not have needed to threaten such severe penalties for a satirical song if that song did not hold genuine power to sway opinion and erode legitimacy. The landscape of sound was a frontier where freedom constantly tested the boundaries of repression, where the human spirit, craving expression, always sought new ways to be heard. Even under the threat of the scold's bridle or the stocks, people found ways to hum a tune of dissent, to gather in a hushed tavern to share a dangerous idea, proving that the most tightly controlled silence could always be broken by a single, courageous voice. Beyond the straightforward commands of bells and the brute force of public proclamations, medieval power had a more subtle and psychologically cunning dimension, one that manipulated not just reality but perception itself. Authorities understood that what people believed they heard could be just as potent a tool for control as any tangible law, and they became masters of crafting auditory illusions to project an aura of invincibility and omniscience. This was power operating in the shadowy realm of the psyche, where a carefully placed echo or a strategically whispered rumor could achieve what a whole garrison of soldiers might not. Consider the potent fear of the supernatural, a force that medieval rulers and clergy were more than happy to harness. A noble seeking to keep poachers or rivals away from a valuable tract of forest or a secluded hunting ground didn't always need to post expensive and easily circumvented guards. A far more effective and cheaper deterrent could be engineered through sound. Stories would be deliberately planted about a particular grove being haunted by the moans of a lost spirit or the clanking chains of a buried knight. Then, to give these stories life, accomplices would be hidden in the woods after dark. A lone traveler or a curious peasant might hear a faint, mournful wail carried on the wind, or the sound of something heavy being dragged through the underbrush, sounds created by a servant blowing across a specially carved tube or rattling a chain in a dry well. These manufactured hauntings created acoustic no-go zones, protecting property and secrets by weaponizing the population's own superstitions, making them the unwitting enforcers of their own exclusion. This manipulation extended from the ethereal to the brutally political through the weaponization of rumor. In an age without mass media, information traveled through the grapevine of gossip and whispered conversation in market squares and taverns. Savvy authorities learned to poison this well deliberately. A rival merchant gaining too much influence might suddenly find himself at the center of a bizarre, baseless rumor, perhaps whispered by an agent provocateur in a crowded alehouse, a story about him cheating his customers or holding heretical beliefs. The origin of the rumor was always murky, a classic case of someone said that they heard from someone else, but its effects were devastatingly real. Public opinion could turn in an instant, reputations could be shattered, and a person's social standing could be erased without their accuser ever having to show their face or present a shred of proof. This was a form of acoustic assassination, a quiet yet brutal exercise of power that maintained order by keeping potential threats off balance and isolated through the simple, untraceable spread of sound. Even the arts were co-opted into this theater of psychological manipulation. During a grand procession or a state visit, the placement of musicians was a matter of precise acoustic calculation. Trumpeters might be stationed at specific points along a castle's walls not just to play a fanfare, but to create a cascading echo effect. As the royal party approached, the initial blast of the horns would be followed a split second later by its reflection off a distant building, making a small contingent of players sound like a vast, unseen army waiting within. This auditory illusion of multiplied force was designed to awe visiting dignitaries and intimidate potential plotters, creating a perception of strength that far exceeded reality. Similarly, musicians playing from hidden niches in a cathedral during a bishop's sermon could make it seem as if the angels themselves were providing a harmonious chorus, elevating the cleric's words from a mere speech to a divinely sanctioned event. These tricks exploited the fundamental psychology of hearing, our innate tendency to believe our ears above all else, to shape reality itself, proving that the most effective authority often resides not in what is, but in what its subjects can be made to believe. The echoes of those medieval towers and hushed streets did not fade with the arrival of the modern age. They simply found new amplifiers, the fundamental playbook of sonic power using sound to surveil, to shape behavior, and to silence dissent has been updated for the digital era, proving that our relationship with the auditory environment is as politically charged as ever. Consider the pervasive nature of contemporary surveillance. the medieval watchman's ear, trained to pick out suspicious whispers in a quiet alley, has its direct descendant in the networked microphone. Today's smart devices, from phones to home assistants, are the ever-listening bell towers of our private lives, constantly passing our conversations not for seditious plots against the crown, but for commercial keywords and behavioral data. This passive, omnipresent audio monitoring creates a normalized culture of surveillance, a digital curfew where we unconsciously regulate our own speech, aware that our words are not entirely our own. The power has shifted from the singular authority of the church bell to the distributed corporate authority of the algorithm, but the effect conditioning populations through the constant possibility of being overheard is hauntingly familiar. This engineering of our auditory experience extends beyond surveillance into the very fabric of public discourse. Medieval town criers controlled the official narrative by being the sole, authoritative voice in the square. Today, this control is exercised through the complex algorithms of social media and news feeds. These digital curators act as acoustic architects for the modern mind, amplifying certain messages and muffling others to create a personalized and often polarized soundscape. The goal is no longer just to inform, but to engage and enrage, to keep users within a platform's walled garden by feeding them a relentless stream of content that confirms their biases. This creates a series of sonic bubbles, much like the acoustic segregation of medieval elites from the commoner's din, where different segments of the population hear entirely different versions of reality. The curated outrage and viral trends are the modern equivalent of the alarm bell or the victory fanfare, designed to trigger specific emotional and behavioral responses that serve the platform's need for engagement rather than the public's need for understanding. Even our physical public spaces remain battlegrounds for sonic control, governed by rules that continue to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies. Modern noise ordinances, while essential for public health and peace, often betray a class bias that would be recognizable to a medieval guild master. The relentless, bass-heavy thump of a nightclub in a trendy district might be tolerated as the sound of economic vitality, while the same volume from a car stereo in a working-class neighborhood is swiftly penalized as a public nuisance. The sounds of industry and commerce are granted more leeway than the sounds of community and celebration in certain zip codes. This selective enforcement defines whose noise is considered valuable and whose is disposable, creating authorized and unauthorized sonic territories just as surely as the medieval council did when it banished blacksmiths from near the monastery walls. The right to make noise and the right to complain about it remains a potent indicator of social power and privilege. Yet this historical perspective is not meant to foster despair, but to provide a critical lens, a kind of acoustic literacy for the modern citizen. By understanding that our soundscapes have always been engineered, we can begin to listen more critically to our own world. We can ask who benefits from the constant, soothing music in retail spaces designed to lower our inhibitions and encourage spending. We can question the psychological impact of the endless notification chimes that fracture our attention and demand immediate response, regimenting our time as effectively as any monastic bell. Recognizing these strategies is the first step toward reclaiming agency. It empowers us to create our own counter-soundscapes, to seek out moments of intentional quiet, to support independent media that breaks from algorithmic curation, and to use our own voices in public spaces to assert a narrative not dictated by commercial or political interests. The legacy of medieval sonic engineering teaches us that the fight for control over our ears is perennial, but so is the human capacity to listen for truth and to speak for freedom. From the commanding toll of bells to the enforced hush of curfews, medieval cities masterfully engineered sound and silence as tools of power. This auditory control shaped every aspect of life, reinforcing hierarchies, maintaining order, and suppressing dissent through what was heard and what wasn't. The rhythm of the day, the flow of commerce, the practice of faith, and even the administration of justice were all choreographed within a carefully constructed soundscape designed to keep everyone in their place. It was a world where the very air seemed to vibrate with intention, where power wasn't just seen in stone walls and fortified gates, but felt in the echoes of a crowded street and the profound quiet of a midnight curfew. This was not a passive backdrop to history. It was an active, living instrument of social control, as vital to maintaining the medieval order as any lawbook or army. As we reflect on this intricate history, we cannot help but hear its echoes resonating powerfully in our own modern world. The strategies have evolved with technology, but the fundamental playbook remains strikingly familiar. Today, our soundscapes are no longer dominated by church bells and town criers, but by the curated playlists in retail stores designed to subconsciously influence our spending habits, the constant ping of notifications that regiment our attention and fragment our time, and the algorithmic curation of our news feeds that creates personalized auditory bubbles, amplifying certain voices, silencing others. The ever-present hum of surveillance systems, the sonic branding of corporations that worm their way into our heads, and the political use of media to shape public sentiment, all of these are the direct descendants of the medieval world's understanding that whoever controls the auditory environment controls the minds and behaviors of the people within it. By understanding these historical strategies, we gain a critical lens through which to examine our own sonic surroundings. We become more aware, more acoustically literate. We can start to ask important questions about the sounds that permeate our lives. Who is benefiting from this constant stream of noise? What behaviors is this melody designed to encourage? Why is this message being amplified while that perspective is being muffled? This awareness is the first and most crucial step toward reclaiming agency over our own auditory space. It allows us to consciously seek out moments of intentional silence, to critically evaluate the media we consume, and to use our own voices to challenge dominant narratives and create our own counter-soundscapes of community and dissent. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. As you go about your day, take a moment to really listen to the world around you. What sounds in your own life feel engineered for a specific purpose, whether for control, for commerce, or for comfort? Have you noticed the ways in which sound and silence are used in your workplace, your city, or your online spaces? Share your observations and reflections in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the hidden acoustics of power in our own time. And if you found this journey into the past enlightening, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more deep dives into the fascinating and often overlooked histories that continue to shape our present in profound